So I want to dispel some of these because no, Kuwait was not nothing prior to the invasion. As a matter of fact, I already said there's a major difference between Kuwait and Iraq as far as prior to the invasion, during the invasion, and after the invasion. One of the biggest things that Kuwait had going for them was they had set up a sovereign fund for the guarantee of the future of the Kuwait people. So let's get into this just a little bit so you guys get an idea of what's going on. Although the oil is a big part of Kuwait's revenue, that's not the only thing they rely on. With the exception of fish, most of their food is imported. They have cultivated land, industry, petroleum extraction and refinery, fertilizer, chemicals, desalination, construction materials like bricks and blocks. They have services like public administration, finance, real estate, trade, hotels, and restaurants. The exports make up approximately 46.87 billion. So they export more than they import. They import 15.67 billion. So Kuwait actually has been under the control loosely and mostly by an emir called the Sabah family. It says Kuwait enjoyed an unprecedented period of prosperity under the emir who died in 1977 after ruling for 12 years. So they had a period of prosperity, the Kuwait people did. This is prior to the invasion from Iraq, and that carried over. So he died in 1977, but for 12 years, their economy was booming. They were very prosperous. Under his rule, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia signed an agreement dividing the neutral zone, called the divided zone, and so they had new international boundaries. And because of this, both countries shared equal the divide zones, petroleum, onshore and offshore. The country was transformed into a highly developed welfare state with a free market economy prior to the invasion. So in August of 1990, Iraq attacked and invaded Kuwait. Right here, following several weeks of aerial bombardment, the UN-mandated coalition led by the United States began a ground assault in February 1991. So Iraq had invaded and occupied Kuwait for approximately 7 months. That's it, 7 months. Okay, keep that in mind. They had an established currency with a value. They had a thriving economy. Prior to Iraq invaded and occupied Kuwait, it was only for 7 months. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't living there to say only 7 months. It probably didn't feel that way to the Kuwait people. I'm not trying to downplay the misery that they went through having Iraq there. I'm just saying, for this example of what I'm trying to cover, 7 months doesn't seem that long. During this invasion and during this occupation, the currency was devalued because it was being stolen from them. Their wealth was being stolen. But the emir, the government of Kuwait, and many Kuwaitis took refuge in Saudi Arabia and other nations. The emir and the government successfully managed Kuwaiti affairs from Saudi Arabia, London, and elsewhere during the period, relying on substantial Kuwaiti investments available outside Kuwait for funding and war-related expenses. What did they rely on? Remember I told you, they had already set up the sovereign fund. And I'll never forget somebody's comment in there was, I don't care if they had a sovereign fund or not, Pimpy. They didn't have enough money to cover all the expenses for the war and the rebuilding and everything else. Actually, they did. You see, the sovereign fund had approximately $100 billion in it. This is in 1990. $100 billion. Relying on substantial Kuwaiti investments available outside of Kuwait for funding and war-related expenses. So as far as their economy and everything else was going, sure, there were some damages to buildings. They had to go in there and rebuild and everything else, but they didn't have to take out loans, and they weren't under any kind of sanctions or anything like that. They had put money aside for a rainy day, so to speak. They had $100 billion that they could draw from. From 1991 to 1993, they ended up spending just a little over half of that. So they still had somewhere between $40 and $50 billion in their sovereign fund. They used that to survive on. Iraq didn't have a sovereign fund. And this is what I was talking about, is the big difference between Kuwait and Iraq. So here we go, we come down here to the economy. Kuwait has a small, relatively open economy dominated by the oil industry and the government sector. Approximately 90% of the Kuwaiti citizen labor force works in the public sector. By the way, Kuwait offers guaranteed employment for the citizens. In other words, you do got to get off your ass, but they do have a job for you. And 90% of the private sector workers are non-Kuwaitis. Kuwait's proven crude oil reserves of about 101.5 billion barrels, 9% of the world's reserves, account for nearly 60% of the GDP, 95% of its export revenues, and 80 to 90% of the government's income. So just like Iraq, they do rely a lot on oil sales. During the 1970s, Kuwait benefited from a dramatic rise in oil prices that Kuwait actively promoted through its membership with OPEC. The economy suffered from a triple shock in the 1980s. So first you had a 1982 securities market crash. In the mid-80s, the price of oil dropped. And in 1990, of course, you had the invasion and occupation from Iraq. The Kuwaiti government in exile depended upon its $100 billion in overseas investment during the Iraqi occupation to help pay for the reconstruction. There's no loans. They paid for it themselves. Thus, by 1993, the balance was cut to less than half of the pre-invasion levels. So somewhere around between $40 and $50 billion. Kuwait's wealth fund set for banner year after bet on U.S. equities. This article is from just the other day. More than half of the $800 billion fund is invested in U.S. assets. $800 billion. Back then they only had $100. Now they have $800 billion. That's close to $1 trillion set up in their fund. So if their budget goes deficit, they don't have to borrow money like Iraq does. So prior to the invasion, Iraq had a real thriving economy. It really was. By the 1980s, Iraq had the second largest economy in the Arab world after Saudi Arabia, and the third largest in the Middle East, and had developed a complex, centrally planned economy dominated by the state. Although the economy, particularly petroleum exports, suffered during the Iran-Iraq war, GDP actually fell in some years. The invasion of Kuwait, Iraq's subsequent defeat in the Persian Gulf War, and the UN embargo began in the 1990s, dealt a far greater blow to the financial system. Little hard evidence is available on Iraq's economy after 1990. That's the problem, is you can't get real numbers nor real data from Iraq at all. Instead, the best estimated available indicates that in the year following the Persian Gulf War, GDP dropped to less than 1/4 of its previous levels. Under the UN embargo, the Iraq economy languished for the next 5 years. It wasn't until Iraqi government implemented the UN's Oil for Food program in 1997 that Iraq's GDP again began to experience positive annual growth. Iraq was in such a bad position at the time that they had to sign what's known as the Paris Club Agreement. This is the thing that Dr. Shabibi did not want to get involved in. He said the agreement and the way they would set up their monetary policies was great at lowering inflation, but was terrible at strengthening the value of the Iraqi dinar. He was against it. He had to be talked back into the table to sign this agreement. 19 of the wealthiest creditors in the nation agreed to counsel 80% of Iraq's $40 billion in debt to 19 members. Imagine if they didn't counsel this, they would still have a ton of debt. Iraq's development fund. This is like the sovereign fund that Kuwait had. In May of 2003, following the invasion of Iraq in March of that year, the Central Bank of Iraq Development Fund for Iraq account was created. So they didn't even have a sovereign fund that was created until 2003. The problem is you go down here, you find out there's a lot of shenanigans involved with that account. When they try to audit it, they weren't being very open or honest about the audit. There's a lot of money confiscated from Saddam Hussein and his sons that was put into this fund. So they had to take control of the development fund away from Iraq. So after doing the audit, they could not really tell how much money was in the fund. So you had this really corrupt government in Iraq. See, not the same as Kuwait. Kuwait used their funds to rebuild their country. They didn't have to rely on people cutting their debt. They didn't have to rely on people donating funds to their country that was siphoned off and stolen from the Iraqi government. This is why Iraq is in a worse situation than Kuwait was. This is why it says right here, thus by 1993, the balance was cut to less than half. That's what I was saying. So they had $100 billion between 91 and 93. They had to use that money to rebuild. It was now less than half before, somewhere between $40 and $50 billion. Even so, that's unbelievable. And you've seen how much it's grown since then. Now they have over $800 billion in there. Iraq is just now contributing to their wealth fund. The wealth of Kuwait is based primarily on oil and capital reserves, and the Iraqi occupation severely damaged both. Although both had been restored as reconstruction has proceeded and oil prices have risen, Kuwait enjoyed an economic boom following Operation Iraqi Freedom, as many companies worked in Iraq, established offices in Kuwait, and procured goods through Kuwait companies. So it's not so much that the companies went there to help with reconstruction, which they did, but most of these companies established offices in Kuwait but worked in Iraq. And the materials that they needed to help rebuild Iraq were coming out of Kuwait. See right here, Chris is saying Kuwait revalued immediately. And when it did, it was flooded with businesses and companies that made it what it is today. And all Kuwait had was oil back then. But to say that they didn't have anything would be wrong. They had prosperity from the 1970s that carried over until the invasion. The banking, financial services, logistics, telecommunications, and construction sectors in particular have grown. The sustained high oil prices have provided the Kuwait government with a windfall revenue between 2005 and 2006. Now let me show you how prosperous Kuwait is. It's supposed to be one of the richest nations in the world, and we have nothing like this. Social benefits. The government has sponsored many social welfare, public works, and development plans financed with oil and investment revenues. Amongst the benefits for Kuwaiti citizens are retirement income, marriage bonuses. Can you believe this? Housing loans. The Kuwaiti citizens have guaranteed employment through the government, and they are in the public sector. Free medical services and education at all levels. So free medical service and education. By decree, the Emir, the government occasionally disperse a portion of the budget surplus as a grant to all Kuwaiti citizens. That's the surplus. So if they have a deficit, then you might not get no money. But if you have a surplus, which means you're way under budget, then that money goes to the Kuwaiti citizens. In September 2006, the Emir granted 200 Kuwaiti dinars, approximately $700, was paid to every citizen who applied. Foreign nationals residing in Kuwait did not have access to these welfare services. So whenever the government budgets their money, there's a reward for not just the government. The surplus goes to the people. Now, that's 700 dinars. It doesn't sound like a lot of money, but anytime your government gives you money because you were under budget, man, that's an awesome incentive to do good for the country. So besides the oil that we are aware of, you have small manufacturers. Large water desalination, ammonia, desulfurization, fertilizers, bricks, blocks, cement plants. During the invasion, Iraq looted all of their equipment. So then obviously it was replaced with more modernized equipment. Agriculture is limited by the lack of water and arable land. They had the most arable country in the world. Except for when the fires were lit, it saturated the ground with oil and ruined it. Arable means a place where you can grow farms, you know what I mean? And nobody was using it back in the olden days before the fires broke and ruined most of that. So you can imagine you have a country with very fertile grounds for you to do agriculture that wasn't hardly being used, but thanks to Iraq lighting these fires, it ruined all that land. So fish and shrimp are plentiful in territorial waters, and large-scale commercial fishing has been undertaken locally in the Indian Oceans. Yes, Kuwait was something prior to the invasion, and they became more after the invasion. The government's two reserve funds, here you go. The Fund for Future Generations and the General Reserve Fund, which totaled nearly $100 billion prior to the invasion in 1990, were the primary source of capital for the Kuwaiti government during the war. What did it say was the primary source? What did that person say in my comments? There wasn't enough money in that fund to help them through do rebuilding and reconstruction. There wasn't enough. No, there was, obviously. Not only was there enough money, but they used just barely over half of the money to do the rebuilding. While these funds were depleted down to 40 to 50 billion after the war, total external assets, including the two reserve funds and the public fund for the Social Security, are currently estimated to be around 160 billion. The bulk of this is invested in the United States, Germany, United Kingdom. So not only are they invested in a lot of places that give them returns, but they also lend out a lot of money. Look at this. The Kuwait Fund issued loans and technical assistance grants totaling 419 million during the fiscal year ending in March 31st, 2003. After the 2003 Madrid conference, the government of Kuwait pledged 1.5 billion in assistance to Iraq, even after they were invaded. So you can't say that Kuwait wasn't established. They were already established. They had the largest sovereign fund already set aside that helped them get through those rainy days. and still had just a little under half left over after they rebuilt. Yeah, those outside companies came in to help, but just keep in mind, how they helped was establishing offices in Kuwait and using the resources in Kuwait to help build Iraq. You're trying to say that Iraq is bigger, better, has all the more resources than Kuwait, and they do. They actually have the fifth largest amount of natural resources of any countries in the world. All that stuff sounds lovely, but the two situations are different. Kuwait had a sovereign fund. Their economy did come to a standstill, but they were quickly rebuilt because of the money that they had put aside. Businesses came into Kuwait. Now keep in mind, they came in between 2003 and 2005, not 1991, between 2003 and 2005, and established offices in Kuwait. So it wasn't that the businesses rushed in there and that's how they became rich after the invasion. They didn't show up after the invasion until 11, 12 years later. And then they had another economical boom between 2003 and 2005. But when it came to reconstruction, they used Kuwait's materials. Like I said, Kuwait did bricks, they did blocks, they had a lot of construction material that they used over in Iraq, and this gave another economic boom to Kuwait. So can the Iraqi dinar get as valuable as the Kuwait dinar? Of course it could. There's a lot of hurdles there. Are they going to be reinstated? No, two different stories. Although the economy came to a standstill, the Kuwait government was still able to do business as usual outside of Kuwait, using money that they had in their reserve fund. Iraq did not have that. Not to mention the fact that Saddam Hussein, prior to the central bank being there, set his own exchange rate at $3+. Saddam Hussein set that amount and then printed the hell out of the Iraqi dinar, causing the value of the Iraqi dinar to drop. Now add in sanctions from the UN and everybody else around the world, the removal from the SWIFT system, the removal off the Forex, all these things contributed. So you can't compare Kuwait to Iraq because there's no comparisons. The countries are set up different, ran different. Does Iraq have the ability to be similar to what Kuwait has? Of course it does. But they got a long ways to go. So I wanted to come through and dispel some of these myths. Two different situations altogether. Anyways, that's it for now. I appreciate you guys chiming in. I look forward to hearing from you. I'm out.